Welcome to Horrified Stories. More fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story. The Last Train Home. It was a bitterly cold night in late December, and the snow fell in heavy sheets across the city. Amelia clutched her overstuffed bag as she rushed into the dimly lit station. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked tiles. The station was eerily empty, save for a man mopping the floor at the far end, his motion slow and repetitive. Amelia checked her phone. 11:57 p.m. She sighed. The last train to Ridgewood was scheduled for midnight, and missing it meant being stranded in the city overnight. She couldn't afford a hotel, and her apartment back in Ridgewood held all her comforts: her warm bed, her cat, Mochi, and the safety of familiarity. The idea of lingering in this desolate station chilled her as much as the icy wind outside. The announcement system crackled to life, startling her. The last train to Ridgewood will be arriving shortly. Please stand behind the yellow line. Amelia hurried down the platform, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She glanced around, half expecting to see other late-night travelers, but the platform remained unsettlingly empty. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the city above. The train pulled into the station, with a groan of brakes and a hiss of steam. Its sleek silver frame reflected the flickering lights, but something about it seemed, the windows were completely black, as if covered with some opaque film, and the train seemed longer than she remembered. It stretched far into the shadows, disappearing down the platform. Amelia hesitated. She peered into one of the windows, but her reflection stared back, warped and distorted. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a dark interior. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The air felt colder in the train, carrying a faint metallic tan. The lights flickered overhead as she moved down the aisle. The seats were old-fashioned, upholstered in faded red velvet, with brass armrests that gleamed faintly. It was a stark contrast to the modern train she was used to. She glanced around nervously. Where were the other passengers? Where was the conductor? She chose a seat near the middle of the carriage and sat down, clutching her bag tightly. Her heart thumped in her chest as the door slid shut behind her. The train lurched forward with a jolt, and she was on her way home, or so she thought. The first few minutes were uneventful. Amelia stared out the window, watching the dark tunnels blur past. But as the train sped on, she noticed something strange. The tunnel seemed endless. Normally, Ridgewood Station was only a 20-minute ride, with a few brief stops along the way. Yet, there were no announcements, no station lights flashing past, only the unbroken darkness outside. Her unease grew. She checked her phone for the time: 12:23 a.m. The battery icon blinked red, and a second later, the screen went black. Frustrated, she shoved it back into her bag and glanced around. She still hadn't seen another soul on board. Suddenly, the train jerked violently, throwing her forward. She gripped the edge of her seat as the lights flickered again, plunging the carriage into darkness for a moment. When they came back on, her breath caught in her throat. A figure sat in the seat across the aisle. Amelia hadn't seen or heard anyone board. The figure was hunched over, dressed in a long, tattered coat. Their face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, tilted low. They didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. "Hello," Amelia called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. She felt a chill creep down her spine. She wanted to move to another carriage, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Summoning her courage, she tried again. "Excuse me, do you know how long until we reach Ridgewood?" No answer. Amelia's pulse quickened. She glanced back toward the doors at the end of the carriage, but they seemed impossibly far away now. The train felt longer than before, the shadows deeper. The figure suddenly shifted, and Amelia stifled a gasp. Its head turned slowly toward her, revealing a pale, sunken face with hollow eyes. The corners of its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, exposing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. Amelia bolted from her seat, clutching her bag like a shield. She stumbled down the aisle, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She threw open the door to the next carriage and slammed it shut behind her. This carriage was identical to the last: faded red seats, brass armrests, and flickering lights. It, too, was empty, but the oppressive silence seemed louder here. She hurried down the aisle, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. The figure hadn't followed her, at least, not that she could see. She reached the end of the carriage and opened the door to the next one. Again, it was the same, identical, empty. The train seemed endless, a repeating loop of carriages that stretched into infinity. As she moved through the train, Amelia began to notice subtle differences. In one carriage, the seats were torn, the velvet upholstery shredded as if by claws. In another, the windows were cracked, spiderweb fractures distorting the view of the impenetrable darkness outside. And in one carriage, the air was thick with the stench of decay. Her panic turned to desperation. She needed to find anyone. She tried opening the doors to the side of the train, but they wouldn't budge. She pounded on the windows, screaming for help, but her voice was swallowed by the void. In the next carriage, she stopped dead in her tracks. The figure from earlier was there, seated at the far end, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It hadn't been there a moment ago. Amelia's breath hitched. She backed away slowly, but the figure stood, its movements jerky and disjointed, like a puppet on strings. It took a step toward her, and she turned and ran. Her footsteps echoed loudly as she sprinted through the endless carriages. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear Ditto's uneven, scraping footsteps following her. After what felt like hours, she burst into a new carriage and frowned. This one was different. The seats were gone, replaced by rows of rusted iron cages. The walls were covered in dark stains that looked disturbingly like blood, and hanging from the ceiling were dim, swinging lanterns, their light casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. Amelia's heart pounded as she edged forward. Inside one of the cages, she saw a figure, a man, his face gaunt and his clothes in tatters. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wide with terror. "Help me," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "It won't let us leave." "What won't let us leave?" Amelia whispered, gripping the bars of the cage. "The train," the man rasped. "It's alive. It feeds on us, on our fear." Before she could respond, a low growl echoed through the carriage, deep and guttural. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. The man in the cage began to sob, shaking his head. "It's here," he whispered. "Run." Amelia turned just in time to see the shadowy figure step into the carriage. But now, it was no longer human. Its form was twisted and monstrous, its hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She ran. The cages rattled as she passed, their occupants screaming for help, their voices blending into a cacophony of despair. She didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't think. Her only thought was escape. She finally reached the last carriage, her chest heaving, her legs trembling. The end of the train loomed before her, a solid steel door with no handle. She pounded on it, screaming for help, but it didn't budge. Behind her, the growl grew louder, closer. The lights flickered violently, and she could feel the presence closing in, its malevolent energy pressing down on her. In a last, desperate act, she turned and faced the darkness. Amelia pressed her back against the cold steel door at the end of the train. The growling behind her grew louder, filling the carriage with an oppressive weight. The twisted shadow figure lumbered closer, its glowing eyes piercing through the flickering light. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she felt the cold breath of doom creeping closer. With no other options, she groped at the steel door behind her. To her surprise, her fingers brushed over a faint seam in the metal, almost invisible. A desperate push revealed it to be a hidden panel. With a grinding sound, the door slid open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. She didn't think, she just moved. The growl rose into an ear-splitting shriek as she slipped through the opening, slamming the panel shut behind her. Darkness engulfed her. The staircase spiraled downward, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the strange, soft material beneath her shoes. The walls around seeped a viscous liquid that smelled of rust and decay, and faint whispers echoed around her, disjointed voices, speaking in languages she didn't understand. Her breath fogged in the freezing air. When she reached the bottom, the space opened up into a cavernous room, unlike anything she'd ever seen. The train had somehow expanded impossibly, its exterior dimensions betraying the sheer size of this underground space. Rusted pipes crisscrossed the ceiling, leaking steam and a strange black sludge. Dim, reddish light pulsed rhythmically, casting eerie shadows on the walls. At the center of the room was a massive, ancient machine. It resembled the engine of a steam locomotive, but it was far too large, its metallic surface adorned with intricate carvings of grotesque faces and symbols. The carvings seemed to writhe and shift when Amelia tried to focus on them. Suspended from the ceiling by thick chains was a figure, a man, or what was left of him. His gaunt, skeletal body was wrapped in a tattered conductor's uniform. His eyes were hollow sockets, and his jaw hung slack, as though he had been screaming for an eternity. Black veins snaked across his exposed skin, pulsing faintly in rhythm with the machine's light. Amelia stepped forward, her trembling hands clutching her bag as if it could protect her. The man's head snapped toward her with an unnatural jerk, and his jaw clicked shut. "You shouldn't be here," the conductor rasped, his voice a guttural growl that reverberated through the cavern. "No one leaves once they board." Amelia swallowed hard, her voice shaking. "What is this place? What's happening? I just want to get home." The conductor let out a dry, rattling laugh that sent chills down her spine. "Home? This is your home now. The train claims all who ride it. You were chosen, like the rest of us." "Chosen?" Amelia stammered. "For what? I didn't. You stepped on willingly," the conductor interrupted, his voice sharp. "That's all it takes. The train is alive, and it hungers. It feeds on fear, despair, and hope turned to ash. Every passenger becomes a part of it, fueling its endless journey." Amelia shook her head, backing away. "No, no, that's not possible. This isn't real." The conductor's face twisted into a grotesque grin. "Deny it all you want, but the train has plans for you. You've already begun to change." Before she could respond, the machine roared to life, its pistons pumping and gears grinding. The walls of the cavern trembled, and a deep vibration hummed through the floor. The conductor let out a blood-curdling scream, his body convulsing as dark tendrils emerged from the machine and wrapped around him. The grotesque carvings on the machine began to glow, their shapes shifting into new, even more horrific forms. Amelia turned and ran. Amelia ascended the staircase, her legs burning with exertion. She didn't stop until she was back in the carriages above. Gasping for breath, she leaned against the nearest seat, her mind racing. Was the conductor telling the truth? Was she truly trapped here forever? As she caught her breath, she heard a faint voice. "Amelia." She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A woman was standing in the aisle, her face familiar. It was Clara, her childhood friend. The two of them had grown up together in Ridgewood, but had drifted apart over the years. "Clara," Amelia whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Clara smiled, though her eyes were sad. "I've been here a long time. Too long." She stepped closer, her movements deliberate. "When I disappeared years ago, this is where I ended up. The train took me, Amelia, just like it's taking you." "No," Amelia said, shaking her head. "There has to be a way out. We can find it together." Clara's expression darkened. "There is no way out. The train decides who lives, who dies, and who becomes part of it. I've seen it happen. I've seen people consumed." Amelia reached out, grabbing Clara's arm. "We'll figure it out. We can't just give up." Clara's gaze softened, but she pulled her arm free. "You don't understand. The longer you're here, the more it changes you. You've already felt it, haven't you? A cold, the whispers, visions." Amelia frowned. She had been feeling strange ever since she boarded. The air seemed heavier, her thoughts clouded, and her reflection in the train's windows looked distorted, like it wasn't entirely hers. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. Clara hesitated, then said, "The train is taking you, slowly, piece by piece. It feeds on your fear first, then your mind, then your soul. But there's one way to slow it down." "How?" Amelia asked desperately. Clara's expression was unreadable. "You have to take someone else's place. The train only releases one when another is offered." Amelia stared at Clara, horrified. "You're saying I have to sacrifice someone? I can't do that." "It's the only way," Clara said softly. "It's how I survived this long. I brought people here, Amelia, strangers, friends. I thought I could live with it, but the guilt, it's unbearable." Amelia stepped back, shaking her head. "No, there has to be another way." Clara's face twisted with anguish. "You think I didn't look? I searched every inch of this train. I begged the conductor. I fought the shadows. But the train doesn't care. It never stops. It never lets go." Suddenly, a loud screech echoed through the carriage. The lights dimmed, and the air grew heavy with the smell of burnt metal. Clara's eyes widened with terror. "It's coming. You have to decide. Amelia, you can't hesitate when the time comes." Before Amelia could respond, Clara turned and ran, disappearing into the next carriage. The shadows at the far end of the train began to move, coalescing into a monstrous shape. It was the same creature as before, but now it was larger, its glowing eyes brighter, its twisted limbs reaching out like gnarled roots. Amelia gripped her bag tightly and ran in the opposite direction. As she fled, Amelia's mind raced. Was Clara right? Was sacrifice the only way to escape? She didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was mounting. The train was alive, and it was slowly consuming her. She stumbled into a carriage that was different from the others. At the far end was a door marked with strange, glowing symbols. They pulsed faintly, drawing her closer, The whispers in her head grew louder as she approached, their tones both soothing and menacing. The door creaked open, revealing a small chamber bathed in golden light. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it lay a strange object, a small, ornate key carved from bone. Amelia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but something about the key felt important. She stepped forward and reached out, her fingers trembling. The moment she touched the key, the train let out a deafening roar, and the world around her began to dissolve. The golden light disappeared as soon as Amelia grasped the strange bone key, plunging her into darkness. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. She heard the train groan, its metallic bones shifting, as though it had felt her defiance. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and the whispers in her mind turned into sharp, agonizing screams. But then, light returned to golden, but a cold, silvery glow. She was no longer in the chamber with the pedestal. Instead, she found herself standing in the middle of another carriage. This one was unlike any she had seen before. The walls of the carriage were lined with mirrors, each one cracked and stained with a dull, reddish tint. Amelia could see herself reflected over and over, her distorted image stretching endlessly in all directions. She stepped forward cautiously, her shoes making soft, with squelching sounds on the sticky floor. She didn't want to think about what she might be walking on. As she moved, the mirrors began to shift. Her reflections no longer mimicked her movements perfectly. Some lagged behind, while others moved before she did, as though anticipating her actions. One reflection smiled at her, its lips curling in a way her own face never had. Amelia frowned. The smiling reflection stepped out of sync entirely, raising a hand to wave. Amelia's hand remained at her side. Then, the reflection's smile widened unnaturally, its mouth stretching far beyond the limits of a human face. "I don't like this," Amelia whispered, backing away. The reflection's voice echoed back, layered and warped. "You think the key will save you?" Amelia's fingers tightened around the bone key in her hand. "What do you want from me?" The reflection's eyes darkened, turning into black voids. "The same thing the train wants, everything." The words sent a chill through her. She turned away, refusing to look at the mirrors anymore. But the moment she did, she saw something worse. The distorted figures from the mirrors were stepping out into the carriage. One by one, they peeled themselves away from the glass, their cracked, shimmering bodies creaking and groaning as they moved. Their faces were twisted versions of her own, some crying, some laughing, others screaming silently. Amelia ran. The carriage seemed to stretch endlessly, the rows of mirrors multiplying with each step. The reflections pursued her, their movements jerky and inhuman. She clutched the key tightly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. Finally, she burst through the door at the end of the carriage, slamming it shut behind her. The reflections banged against the glass, their faces pressed against the small window, but they didn't follow her into the next space. She turned around and found herself in a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The walls here were made of dark, pulsating flesh, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. At the far end of the hallway was another door, this one carved from blackened wood and etched with glowing runes. As she approached, the runes on the door flared to life, bathing her in a pale green light. She could feel the bone key in her hand growing warm, as though it were reacting to the door. Before she could insert the key, a voice whispered from the shadows, "Are you sure you want to open it?" Amelia spun around, her heart pounding. Clara stepped out from the darkness, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Amelia demanded. "How did you find me?" Clara didn't answer the question. Instead, she looked at the door, her face pale. "That door doesn't lead to freedom, Amelia. It leads to a choice that will change everything." "What kind of choice?" Amelia asked, gripping the key tighter. Clara hesitated, her eyes filled with sorrow. "The train won't let you leave unless you give it something in return. A life for a life. If you open that door, you'll have to choose who takes your place." Amelia's stomach churned. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Clara said softly. "I've been here long enough to know that. The train is alive, and it's hungry. It needs someone to fuel its endless journey." "No," Amelia whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not doing this. I'm not sacrificing anyone." Clara stepped closer, her voice urgent. "If you don't, you'll become part of the train, just like me. You'll be trapped here forever, slowly fading away until there's nothing left of who you are." Amelia looked at the door, then back at Clara. "Why are you helping me?" Clara smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened with ice tears. "Because I made my choice a long time ago. I've already taken too much from others. If there's even a chance you can escape, I want to help." Before Amelia could respond, the train shuddered violently. A low growl reverberated through the walls, and the flesh-like surfaces of the hallway began to pulse faster. The train knew what they were planning. "Go," Clara urged, "before it's too late." Amelia hesitated for only a moment before shoving the key into the lock. The runes on the door flared brightly, and with a loud, grinding sound, the door creaked open. Amelia stepped through the door and into the heart of the train. The room was massive, its ceiling disappearing into an inky void. At the center was a pulsating, organic massive beating heart made of blackened veins and twisted machinery. Tubes and wires snaked out from it, connecting to the walls and ceiling like arteries. Standing in front of the heart was the conductor, his skeletal form illuminated by the sickly green light emanating from the organ. His hollow eyes fixed on Amelia as she entered. "You found the key," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You've come to bargain." Amelia clenched her fists. "I'm not here to bargain. I'm here to stop this." The conductor laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You can't stop what you don't understand. The train is eternal, and so is its hunger. You think you can defy it. You think you can escape. I have to try," Amelia said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her veins. The conductor gestured toward the heart. "Then make your choice. Offer the train a life, and it may let you go. Refuse, and you will become part of it, your soul feeding its endless journey." Amelia's mind raced. The weight of the key in her hand felt unbearable. Could she really condemn someone else to this nightmare just to save herself? Could she live with that choice? She thought of Clara, of the man in the cage, of the twisted reflections. All of them had been consumed by the train, their lives stolen, their souls trapped. Was she any different from them? The heart throbbed, its pulse growing louder, faster. The conductor watched her silently, waiting for her decision. Amelia stepped forward, her hands trembling as she raised the key. She looked at the heart, then at the conductor, and then she made her choice. The pulsating heart filled the chamber with a rhythmic thrum, each beat sending vibrations through the floor beneath Amelia's feet. The conductor stood motionless, his hollow eyes locked on her. In her hand, the bone key glowed faintly, pulsating in time with the monstrous organ in front of her. Amelia's mind raced as she weighed her options. The conductor had given her a cruel ultimatum: offer the train a life or be consumed by it herself. But as she stared at the grotesque art, something stirred inside her, a flicker of defiance. If this train was alive, maybe it could be killed. Amelia stepped closer to the heart, the key growing warmer in her hand. The veins snaking across the chamber walls began to writhe. As though sensing her intent, the conductor tilted his head, a hint of curiosity in his skeletal features. "What are you doing?" he rasped. Amelia ignored him, her gaze fixed on the key. She remembered the strange symbols on the door and the whispers that had followed her through the train. The key wasn't just a tool. It was connected to the train's power, its life force. If the key could open the door, perhaps it could destroy the heart. The conductor's voice grew sharper. "You cannot destroy the train. It is eternal. It is everything." "We'll see about that," Amelia muttered. She raised the key and drove it into the heart with all her strength. The instant the key pierced the blackened flesh, the room erupted in chaos. The heart convulsed violently, spewing thick, black ichor. The train let out a deafening roar, the walls and floor trembling as though it were in agony. The conductor screamed, his skeletal form collapsing to the ground. Dark tendrils erupted from his body, lashing out in all directions. Amelia staggered backward, shielding her face as the ichor sprayed across the chamber. "You fool," the conductor snarled, his voice layered with rage and fear. "You've doomed us all." The heart began to collapse in on itself, its pulsating light growing erratic. The veins lining the walls snapped like cords under tension, and the chamber started to crumble. Amelia turned and ran as the chamber collapsed behind her. The walls of the train warped and twisted, the once orderly carriages now a nightmarish maze of flesh and metal. The train howled, its voice a cacophony of screeches and groans that rattled Amelia's teeth. The twisted reflections from the hall of mirrors appeared again, their forms even more grotesque and distorted. They clawed at her as she ran, their faces melting and reforming with every step. "Why did you do this?" one of them shrieked, its voice an eerie echo of her own. "You could have been free." Amelia didn't answer. She pushed forward, her only goal to escape the train before it consumed her entirely. As Amelia stumbled into the next carriage, she found Clara waiting for her. The walls here were collapsing, the floor buckling beneath their feet. Clara's face was pale but determined. "You did it, didn't you?" Clara said, her voice barely audible over the train's roars. Amelia nodded, gasping for breath. I stabbed the heart. The train is dying. Clara smiled faintly, but there was sadness in her eyes. You're brave, Amelia, braver than I ever was. Before Amelia could respond, the shadows in the carriage coalesced into a monstrous form. The creature that had hunted her throughout the train now towered over them, its glowing eyes burning with fury. You cannot escape, it bellowed, its voice shaking the walls. You belong to the train. Clara stepped forward, placing herself between the creature and Amelia. Go, she shouted. I'll hold it off. No, Amelia cried. You don't have to do this. Clara turned to her, her expression resolute. Yes, I do. I've been trapped here too long. This is my chance to make things right. Before Amelia could protest, Clara lunged at the creature. The shadows engulfed her, but her sacrifice gave Amelia the precious seconds she needed to escape. With tears streaming down her face, Amelia ran toward the front of the train. The train was falling apart around her, the walls and ceiling caving in. Amelia reached the locomotive at the front of the train, where a massive iron door loomed before her. It was unlike any other door she had seen, intricately carved with runes that glowed faintly, as though waiting for her. The key in her hand was still warm, though its glow had dimmed. She inserted it into the lock and turned. The door creaked open, revealing a blinding white light. Amelia hesitated for only a moment before stepping through. The light faded, and Amelia found herself standing on the platform of a small, quiet train station. The air was crisp and cool, and the faint sound of bird song filled her ears. For a moment, she thought she was home. But as she looked around, she noticed something was off. The station was eerily empty, and the town being it looked different. The buildings were familiar but slightly warped, as though they had been copied from a dream. Amelia's heart sank. She wasn't home. Not really. The train had let her go, but it hadn't returned her to the life she once knew. This place was a facsimile, a shadow of her world. She turned back to the tracks, half expecting to see the train waiting for her. But it was gone, leaving only silence behind. As Amelia stood on the platform, a faint sound reached her as distant whistle of a train. She turned and saw a figure approaching, their outline shimmering in the faint light. They carried a small suitcase and moved with hesitant steps, as though unsure of their destination. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. The train wasn't truly dead. It had simply moved on, searching for its next victim. And as she stood there, watching the figure approach, she felt the faintest whisper in the back of her mind, a voice she recognized all too well. Your journey isn't over. Thanks for watching the video. If you like the story, hit like button and don't forget to subscribe the channel.